Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Susan Mcguire, Director of Professional Development here at ACCE, and I am very happy to welcome you to this afternoon's webinar. Our webinar this afternoon is going to be facilitated by our own ACCE President and CEO, Sherry Ann Kelly, and will be presented by Leslie Horton, Executive Recruiter at Spencer Stewart, Jim Page, CCE, President and CEO of the Chamber of Commerce of West Alabama, and Jamie Henning, CCE, President and CEO of the Greeley Area Chamber. Let me advance this slide here so you see that. Our panel today will be discussing the hiring trends in CEO leadership for chambers of commerce, the skills, training, and resources that can help you transition to your first or your next CEO role, and what search firms and search committees seek when selecting the next head of an organization. Before we get started, just a few housekeeping notes. You all are in listen-only mode to avoid background noise. After the presentations, we will have time for questions, and you can ask the questions by typing them into the question box, which you'll see at the right-hand side of your screen. Feel free to type in your questions at any point during the presentations, and we will take them at the end, but as they come to you, don't hesitate to type them in. We will also have contact information for our presenters at the end of the slide presentation, so you'll be able to reach out to them directly if you would like. Next, the presentation slides are uploaded to the webinar panel. If you take a look at handouts, click on, open that box, click on handouts, you can download it right away. I'll also post that with the recording. And then finally, this session is being recorded. It should be up on our ACCE webinar page no later than Monday the 18th, and I will include the presentation slides with it. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and introduce our facilitator today.
All right. Welcome, everyone. Welcome, everyone. Good to see you. Sherry Ann from ACCE. Happy New Year. I hope everyone is staying safe. This is obviously a topic of interest. We had 165 people sign up for this webinar, so lots and lots of enthusiasm around this particular topic of interest. The start of the new year, we know it's a great time to think about your own career trajectory, your personal development. So I'm really glad that you've joined us, because I think this conversation is going to spark some really good insights and questions for all of us to consider. So whether you're looking to move up in the organization, looking to move on to run a different organization, or if you just want some perspective on the state of chamber CEOs. This past year, it's completely changed our world, and it's changing our industry. And last fall, ACCE put forward our new research on the future of the industry, and that highlights how chambers, and more specifically chamber leaders, really need to rethink how we're doing what we're doing. And what it takes to be a successful leader today is very different than what it took just a few years ago. And that's why I'm so excited about today's panel. Each presenter is going to bring a unique insight into the industry and where they think the leadership of chambers of commerce is heading. So after our three panelists present, we're going to open it up for Q&A, and I highly encourage you to take advantage of asking questions of this group, because they offer a wealth of information. I'll share a little bit about each of the panelists, and then I'll turn it over to them. So today you're going to hear from Leslie Horton, who's manager of Spencer Stewart's Washington, D.C. office. She leads the firm's education, nonprofit, and government affairs practice. And her focus is really on recruiting senior executives in associations, chambers, and nonprofits. Before she went into the search industry, she spent 20 years in association management. Leslie and I actually first met when we were both working at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. And while she was there, she was appointed the first woman senior vice president of that organization. So she has a very long history with and a passion for chambers. Then you're going to hear from Jim Page, CCE, IOM, who's been president and CEO of the Chamber of Commerce of West Alabama since 2012. Before that, he spent 9 years as Vice President of Public Policy and Business Development at the Decatur-Morgan County Chamber of Commerce. He's a past chairman of the Chamber of Commerce Association of Alabama, and he currently serves on ACCE's Board of Directors, as well as our CCE Commission. And then last but not least, you'll hear from Jamie Henning, CCE IOM, who is President and CEO of the Greeley Area Chamber of Commerce and Visit Greeley. She began her career there in 2019, but prior to that, Jamie served as Senior Director at the Lincoln Chamber of Commerce in Lincoln, Nebraska. She served on boards of ACCE as well as the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. She currently serves on our CCE Commission and is also chair of ACCE's Events Division. So as our presenters are sharing, you may think of some questions. Please don't hesitate to go ahead and put those in the questions box that you see on your screen. We'll address them at the end of the presentations, but I know sometimes you can forget what that question is, so feel free to post those as we go. So with that, I'm thrilled to turn things over to Leslie, who's going to share some insights from her CEO searches across the country. Leslie, thanks so much for being with us today.
Thank you, Sherry Ann. Thanks to all of you for joining today. Really appreciate being part of this conversation. As Sherry Ann mentioned, well, you didn't mention this part. My very first job was out of school, was at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. And so that was, which I didn't even know what that was. Is that the Department of Commerce? What is that? So that was many, many years ago. And then I was there for a number of years and then left and then came back, as you said, and was pleased to be the first woman senior vice president. So Chamber, I bleed Chamber blue, and really happy to be part of this conversation today. So I was asked to make just a couple of overview comments on general trends and things that I'm seeing, and then, as Sherry Ann said, after all the presenters have gone through the presentations, we'll have time for Q&A. So basically, just the reality, even during COVID, and despite all of the oddities that we've been adapting to and dealing with over the last year, search is ongoing. We continue, especially in the C-suites of chambers, not-for-profits, and the association world. Some projects were initially put on hold last March when people just really didn't know. None of us knew. What was this going to be like? What was this going to entail? How long was this going to go on? And so a couple people put some things on the back burner. But generally speaking, after we all adjusted, things picked up again, and at least in our world, things have been ongoing. People who were planning retirements are retiring, and so on. And people who are thinking about making a change are still keen to do that. So we continue to be asked for proposals, make pitches, and take on searches. Having said that, obviously the way we are recruiting and the way we are doing the search process has absolutely changed. We always did some work virtually, but initial screens and the like, but now everything has moved to the virtual world. Even interviews and negotiating are being done virtually. I think some of those practices will never go back to pre-COVID, the way things done were pre-COVID. For example, in a typical search process, there's a first round of interviews of maybe 5 or 6, and then it narrows down to a second round of 2 or 3. Historically, those things were done in person. I think certainly during COVID and going forward, at least the first round will be done virtually, and then the second round, when possible, will be done with just 2 or 3 finalists in person. But it has also challenged us to figure out ways for organizations to make those final decisions, even in that virtual world, and without ever shaking the new executive's hand. They are actually hiring their new CEO, and that's been kind of interesting too. It's also been interesting to think about and to see how executives like yourselves are deciding whether or not to make a change during a pandemic. And if we could switch the slides here. Some of them, very much feel that it would be inappropriate to leave their organization at this time, during this difficult time. There's a lot of uncertainty. There's a lot of stuff to be managed. But others are absolutely seeing this as an opportunity to lead, an opportunity to step up, especially if you're not in a current leadership role, if you're in a number 2 or number 3 role, and this is a chance for you to really show what you can do. People are eager to have those opportunities. So we have seen that. But in terms of leadership, I think some of the basics have not changed. Search committees still are looking for people who have a track record of success leading organizations through a strategic thinking, a strategic planning process, who have the ability to bring information together, bring diverse points of views together, and actually lead them through a strategic visioning process that is and has always been key. Executives who have who are natural collaborators and have influencing styles and are effective advocates, those are skills that are ongoing and always in style. A connection to and a passion for the mission. And here at Chambers, I find it's always very interesting when we engage in conversations with search committees. There's usually a conversation that goes one of two ways. Either they want somebody who really knows the community, is a known quantity in the state, in the community, in the region, and they don't have to, and has the same cultural nuances. Other times they say, look, we all know our community. We want to bring somebody in who will bring us a fresh perspective. And that's always the debate that we have with search committees. And my advice is usually, look, you don't go through this process very often. Hopefully you don't. So why not look at both? Why not, at least in this process, be exposed to people who you know and know the community well and are known quantities, as well as people who might have a different perspective or a different experience that they would bring to the table. And the last piece of leadership that is always on every search committee's list is someone who has a track record of advancing diversity, equity, and inclusion. The days of saying what you would do or what you would like to do or what you have seen others do are over. Committees are drilling down hard to say, tell us specifically, what have you done, either in your own organization or with your board or in other kinds of contexts, but what have you actually done to advance the cause of diversity, equity, and inclusion in your organization? So anticipating and having some idea of how to answer those questions with specific examples is usually what search committees like. They don't want to hear what you would do. They want to hear what you have done. And if you can say, for example, we had this situation and this is how it went, that always works very well. So those were the highlights around leadership. I would also say that that Spencer Stuart recently surveyed several Fortune 500 boards to ask if they were looking for anything unique or different in their CEOs, from their CEOs in the midst of this crisis and the pandemic. And what they said, kind of surprisingly to me, was they're looking for CEOs who have been able to show care and empathy for their teams. They're looking for people who have agility, who have the judgment and decision-making abilities in the midst of uncertainties. I've actually had board chairs call me with frustration, and the reason they're thinking about doing a search is because in the middle of the pandemic, the executive became paralyzed. They knew there were things to do, but they just weren't sure. Do I go right or do I go left? And what they really want is somebody who can make a decision and take the team with them. And perhaps my favorite, and again, somewhat surprising that came out of this survey of these boards, is that boards are looking for humility. Does the leader foster a high degree of openness, trust, and collaboration? Are they managing their own ego, engaging employees and embracing a learning mindset? Can they demonstrate their own vulnerability and understanding that while I may have a nice home office that's discreet and quiet, other people are working from their kitchen tables? So having that humility, showing that vulnerability and empathy during this time of crisis and pandemic, those leadership traits are things that have really risen on the scale of things that boards are looking for from their executives. So perhaps I'll end there with a lot of different thoughts and different ways we could go, and turn it back to you, Sherry Ann.
Thank you, Leslie. Lots of good food for thought and ideas that I'm sure we can continue to discuss through the rest of the webinar. Jim, would love to hear a little bit more of your perspective.
Yeah, thank you, Sherry Ann. I appreciate the invitation to participate today, and I feel woefully unqualified to serve on this panel, but I'm honored nonetheless, and certainly it's a real privilege to speak today with Leslie and my colleague Jamie. I'm going to give a quick kind of thumbnail sketch of what my career journey has been to this point, and in doing so, I've kind of boiled down 4 kind of bullet points, kind of lighthearted bullet points that I wanted to share today, kind of lessons learned or things that have worked for me over the years that I think a lot of, as much as things have changed because of COVID, I think a lot of these things are kind of timeless in this profession. So I got a political science degree as an undergraduate, and all I ever wanted to do was work in politics. And so right out of school, I worked in our state capital of Montgomery, doing lobbying and campaign work. And about 2 years into it, of doing what I went to school to do, I had an aha moment one morning, a God moment, and I said, I've got to stop doing this because I'm way too young to be this jaded. So I decided I needed to make a pivot that early in my career and didn't know what to do. But about the same time, one of my best friends from college worked for a congressman at the time, and he said the Chamber of Commerce in Decatur, Alabama, has created a governmental affairs position. You should look into it. And I thought, well, I don't know much about that community, and what does a Chamber of Commerce do? So obviously, like many of you, didn't go to school planning to work for the chamber, but because of connections and relationships and opportunity, looked into it and thankfully was able to be hired in that role. And I was really in it for a couple of weeks and realized, I think this is what I'm supposed to be doing. I loved that I was able to do the government relations part of the job that obviously I was more experienced with, but I instantly fell in love with the membership and the economic development side and just everything that the chamber does. And so I realized pretty early on that this was a career track. It wasn't just a good job at that point in my life. This was a career track that I wanted to pursue. And so over the next 9 years that I was in Decatur, I tried to do, number one on this list is learn as much as I could, as fast as I could. Because I knew that while I was experienced in my one area, the chamber leadership and chamber management is very broad. You have to have a little bit of knowledge about a whole lot of things. And so I encourage you that if this is something that you consider a career, that you get out of your swim lane. If you were hired at your chamber to focus on one particular area, you're probably great at it. But to really advance your career to an executive director or a CEO role, you really have to broaden your scope of understanding and knowledge. And so I participated in anything I could early on. Institute obviously was an early thing I did, but not that this is a commercial for ACCE, that's not why Sherry Ann asked me to do it. But I can tell you, I have taken advantage of ACC offerings my entire career, and I do now more than ever. Because it has allowed me to learn so much about all sides of chamber operations. So whether it's webinars like today, it is going to convention, it's participating in some of the committees or councils or groups, or it's just using the website as an R&D, rip off and duplicate best practices list. I utilize ACCE resources and have throughout my career. So that's why I say learn as much as you can, as fast as you can, and then keep learning because things are always being thrown at us that are new. Chamber mentors. I say here they've been there, done that, and they know people. We all on this call, I'm preaching to the choir when I say this, we're all on this call, we are relationship people. We understand what having a professional network is all about. We understand having people that you can lean on in tough times. And Lord knows 2020 was a tough year. And so we all probably leaned on our colleagues from around the state and around the country that had been through difficult times before and learned from them. And then as you're exploring other career options within the chamber industry, having connections, knowing people in other communities and in other states that may know about opportunities that are on the horizon, that's a great opportunity to know about next steps. Industry credentials. I personally feel like this is important, whether it's IOM through Institute, it's Certified Association Executive, Certified Economic Developer. Maybe your state association has a state-specific credential. I know we have that in Alabama. And then I've highlighted here CCE because I'm admittedly very, very biased. Nothing I have done professionally has ever been better for me than going through the CCE process. I did that 10 years ago. It was a tough, challenging experience, but it forced me, again, to get out of my swim lane and to really learn, do my homework, and understand the broad body of knowledge that is chamber management. And so going through that was an incredible learning experience for me. And two, whether this is right or wrong, I don't know, but I'm going to say it. I always told myself too that if I was ever in the running for a chamber CEO position somewhere, and it came down to myself and one other person, and all things being equal, they had 3, initials after their name, and I didn't. That I didn't want that to be the difference maker of whether or not I got that position. Because if it was, that was on me. That was because I didn't go above and beyond to try to learn and earn those credentials. And so I did that early on, and it quickly paid dividends for me, because after being in Decatur for 9 years, earning the IOM, earning the CCE, I really felt like I was prepared for the next step, and was able to get a great opportunity in Tuscaloosa, Alabama, and I just celebrated my 9th anniversary here. And that brings me to my last point, is that sometimes you have to move out to move up, or move on to move up. And I was at that point in my career when I made that decision. And so I've asked 3 questions here at the bottom that really were questions that I had to ask myself early on. Is one, is this a job or a career? I loved the community I was in. My wife and I started raising a family there, had great friendships. It was a very, very difficult situation in which to leave. But it was the right thing for my career, because it wasn't just a job, it was a career. 2, I asked myself the question, am I willing to relocate in order to move up? The gentleman, the chamber legend that hired me, that's still my mentor to this day, was doing a fantastic job. He still is to this day in Decatur. And so he had empowered me to be able to move on and take on another role. And then finally, are you listening for opportunity to knock? Jobs aren't necessarily going to come to you. You've got to be proactive, and you've got to seek out opportunities. 2 resources I've listed here at the bottom, just because I personally have seen value in them, is certainly the ACCE Job Watch page, which lists upcoming openings for jobs around North America. That's a great resource for you if you're looking at other opportunities. And then many of you probably know Glenn Sheppard. Glenn has been a speaker on the speaker circuit for chambers for many, many years, really talking about HR-related issues, and he's a fixture at convention and all that. Glenn took it upon himself a few years ago to start GlennSheppardJobs.com, and it's a website that he does out of his own pocket and out of goodwill, where he uses his professional contacts around the country to feed him leads on chamber openings that pop up from time to time. And you can sign up through his website to get on his monthly email distribution list. And so sometimes that'll be the easiest way to hear about a job maybe that's popping open somewhere else. And then lastly, obviously, there's some exceptional executive search firms in the country. Leslie certainly at the top of that list. Making yourself known to them, I think, is a great opportunity to put yourself in for opportunities. But I tried to speed through that, and I apologize if I did, but those are just a few things I think that have worked for me throughout my career. And after 18 years of being in the industry and surviving 2020, I feel like it can survive anything. I'm as excited about this career in this industry as I've ever been, and I hope you all feel the same. So again, Sherry Ann, thank you for having me today.
That was fantastic, Jim. Thank you. Some great perspective. I like the questions that you asked yourself, which I think are good questions for our audience to think about as they're thinking about their own career. Interestingly, we have already had some questions pop up in the question box, but just as a reminder, feel free to add your questions there and we will address them after we hear from Jamie. So Jamie, take it away.
Thanks so much. It's an honor to sit here with all of you today, for sure. Actually, interesting that you touched on collaboration. When I started my new endeavor, in my newest job in Greeley, Colorado, I took a poster and I posted it above my desk, and it said collaboration over competition. And I think that is the new way, and it certainly is more than a mantra to me. And I have brought that to my team, and I brought that to my community, but we're going to need each other to move through what we're working through right now. And, I believe the chamber profession is changing. I think it's going to be the better for it. And I think we're actually just getting back to what we were founded on, and that was business survival, right? Making sure our businesses see their way through this and better with lessons learned. So I spent 19 years of my career in Lincoln, Nebraska at the chamber there. It's an incredible chamber. It has economic development, tourism, young professionals, and I had to make some decisions about stepping up into that leadership role and leaving a lot that was comfortable to me, a lot that I had built and And for me, really at the pinnacle of things that I consider part of my brand, building that young professionals group from being one of the founders to watching it thrive and become as large as the chamber with 1,700 members 10 years later. You know, the most important part of that work was developing leaders that were going to step out into that community. Just a couple of weeks ago, someone stepped up to take on a city council role, and it was someone we developed in that group. So that's so incredibly rewarding. And I think all leaders need to place themselves in positions to, you know, rise by lifting others, right? I think that's core to the work we're all doing. I took a little longer than most to step up into my first leadership role. It must be the firstborn in me potentially, but I waited about 7 years after my receiving my CCE to step up into my first leadership role as president. And I will just say of that, I remember the words spoken to me when I went through the CCE process about how the world needs more leaders, and that this wasn't just an exercise in explaining to the world what I wanted and how I wanted to contribute, but that I needed to come back and actually do something with that. And so that stuck with me, and definitely when I stepped into that role, I wanted to honor that commitment to organizations like the one we're on with today, who grow those leaders. So a good friend of mine who went through the CCE process with me, I said, I feel like I just need to work on, you know, supervising and learning how to support employees. And a really good friend of mine who went through the process, who's the president today, said, that's something you work on your whole career. Development of people is the most important role any of us can take on as leaders. You'll never reach some place where you feel entirely comfortable with it. That's a growth curve you'll work on for your whole life. So I think the things that have occurred to me along the way are how much judgment matters. Studying and placing your intent are really important, but in these times there really is no book, right? You want to gain broad knowledge, but you're going to need to step up and make decisions and hustle for your businesses. And so I think executive presence is one of the things that all of us really need to maintain, just that unflappable confidence that your community can have in you as you move ahead. You know, I served around 10 years in roles with the U.S. Chamber and ACCE, and I think that the part that goes maybe unnoticed for a lot of leaders is stepping into those roles is growing you. Every time you agree to moderate a webinar or you step into an opportunity to chair a group, like I've been so fortunate to do, you know, I think as the event division chair for ACCE, it was maybe day 4 of COVID. We had an event conference and hundreds of people were on the webinar. I said, there are 250 people on this webinar, but you realize quickly, you know, everyone really comes around the profession, and we try to help each other and share, and that's what we do. So it's incredible to be on the CCE Commission now and to be able to give back and raise other leaders who want to step into that role. I think one of the things that really needs to be thought about as you step into this is kind of your personal brand development. You know, D&I was mentioned earlier and growing young leaders, and I really had to think about that. That was work I did for a long time, but as I stepped into this, I had to really think about what are my strategic strengths I'm bringing to the table. And I think that's something that you have to do quite a bit of soul searching. You know, the quote I put on my slide today about becoming a leader, it is about authentically being who you are. It's not about advertising yourself as something you're not. So I think you really have to dig in and you have to determine what that looks like. You know, I think the other most important thing I did is I talked to other CEOs. Never forget the important resource that is your board of directors, whether you are an embedded member of the team or you're a leader. When you visit with them, you inherently find out a lot of lessons. You know, I was told before starting the role, there might be times when it's a little bit lonely, right? Or there might be moments when you have a tremendous sense of responsibility you have no idea about today. But also, you know, my board chair this year is actually a regional hospital administrator. They live in metrics. So I'm utilizing her to help define that for the chamber that I'm working with. What does success look like as everything is shifting? So I think never hesitate to lean on them for their best advice. They told me things like, make your board feel heard, understood, and valued. Don't talk about your past experience every day, or your new team will question, you know, why you're here and what we're creating, especially together. So there was just a lot of good advice they endowed on me. I would say alignment with a consultant is so incredibly important. I worked very closely with Waverly Partners, so I was really grateful to Eric and Debbie. They were incredibly helpful in just championing me, and also I think kind of growing my confidence around the confidentiality of the process, right? And the preparation for the interviews, because not just selling yourself, but really understanding yourself and being able to give those specific examples is really critical. One of the most important things you can think about is community alignment. In many ways, stepping into this current role harkens back to some of my history in a small community that had a lot of ag, right? And so it feels really genuine to be part of the community I'm part of. It's booming, but it's also harkens back to things I'm really familiar with. So community alignment is really important as you think about where you want to land. And we also have a really, the average age of our board members is 45. They are onward with some new and exciting ideas, and they want to see change and fresh perspective. So I think, again, just making sure that your brand fits well with where you're going and what you're doing. And so there are a lot of considerations to moving your life somewhere else, right? Especially after you've lived somewhere in one place. And so I think you have to think a lot about the trailing spouse that you might bring there and how happy they can be and how you're going to connect them to that sense of community, because you'll feel it right away. Everyone will lean into you. But adapting to that new community and life somewhere else is certainly a change. So I read a book recently by David Brooks, The Road to Character, and it talked in there about resume virtues versus eulogy virtues. And it was really, it just touched something in me, because I think right now, as you look at what chambers are doing, resume virtues are skills for the marketplace, the things we're talking about today, personal brand and how you land and what you do there. But those eulogy virtues are things like, were you kind? Were you brave? Were you honest? Did you use good judgment? And I think chamber professionals are just being called on to really step into those leadership positions and offer their community some hope there, that they can be empathetic and kind in a moment when everything is shifting, but also that they'll be strong and be a leader. So I'm just really grateful for the opportunity today, and I hope this encourages some of you to step into that. It has been incredibly rewarding. So I'll leave it there for some questions.
Jamie, thank you. Those were, again, some really good thoughts to consider, and I like the idea of eulogy virtues. I think that's something we can all sort of wrap our heads around and think about. We've got some questions in the question box, and one of the first ones that came out said, a note of thanks to everyone for demystifying this process and sharing your experiences. So thanks to all of our panelists for what you've been able to share so far. So this is for the entire panel. Do you see a silver tsunami in the chamber industry coming soon? Do you anticipate that the new wave of leadership will be more diverse, including more of those with strong corporate careers? And I'll sort of add on, there was another question that parallels, what do you see as the skills of the next generation of chamber leadership? So anyone like to tackle that question first?
Well, I mean, I'll just start, and I'm sure my panelists here will have, my co-panelists here will have views as well. But I would say that in terms of diversity and a different level of skill and experience, I think our clients are demanding it. It's not a question of, nice to have or want to have, you got to do it. And I find that the experience mix of for-profit and not-for-profit is always attractive to clients. What I hear 400 times a week is, we need somebody with a for-profit mindset, but an ability to do that in a not-for-profit context. So someone who has the patience and the skills and the willingness to work with and build consensus among often diverse and complicated board structures, but at the same time knows how to drive revenue, drive programs, make business decisions, and communicate those decisions and those paths in a way that resonates with business leaders. So I think that's what we've been looking for a long time, and what we find our clients are valuing, and that is not going to go away. But I defer to Jim and Jamie and see their thoughts on that.
I agree. I think one thing that I think COVID has taught us, I think we've been down this path a long time, is that adaptability, being nimble, is how do you define that skill set? That's a question, but I do think that's what a lot of chambers are looking for. I know here I've probably never felt more of a moral obligation to lead than I have over the last year, because when COVID hit, you look around, whether it was elected officials or your partners in the nonprofit world, whoever, everybody was kind of looking around, go, there's no playbook for this. What do we do? And I'm very proud, as I know a lot of my colleagues in the chamber profession are proud of the role the chambers played in stepping in and saying there is no roadmap for this, there is no playbook, but we're going to lead, we're going to take charge, and we're going to provide resources not only to the business community but to the community at large, and not only to our members but to the community at large. And so I think we've proven our adaptability and all that. So I think chambers realize now that, because I'll say too, I know of chambers around the country that have been paralyzed by COVID. And so I think chambers realize they need that kind of catalytic leadership that ACCE has been talking about for many years. And then two, I'll say this, kind of an elephant in the room, because I am the white guy on the call, is that the typical profile of a chamber CEO is not necessarily the middle-aged or older white guy that looks like a banker. Yeah, I'm being candid because we're all friends here. I do think that the chamber profession does look different than it used to, and is going to continue to look different. I think it's going to more closely mirror the communities in which it represents, and I think that is a fantastic change in our industry.
Yeah, I think from a trends perspective, the true identifying factors of community are going to change in some of the ways that we engage with people, whether it's remote work or office space, Class A office space trends. The look of our communities is going to change, and our role in that is going to change. And so I think that the hustle factor for a lot of us in the CEO roles is really going to matter. We sat and literally watched some of our businesses either have restrictions that force complete shutdown, and watched things retract. But in the meanwhile, in a couple of days, we put recovery funds together and pulled our boards together. So while we've had all of these challenges unexpected, we've had all these opportunities that we never would have imagined we'd do. One of the hospital administrators said, I can't imagine asking my team to do the 30 things I asked them to do over the course of a month before in 3 days. And I think the same could be said of chamber teams. I mean, wow, I think if all of us sit and think about it, we could be moved to emotion on the level of dedication of the teams that we all lead and how much they've hustled around this. So it's impressive, and it's a really interesting time, and we'll continue to do the work. So.
Absolutely. We've never used the word pivot so many times as we have over the past year. So we had two of the same question for Leslie, and that was, what's the best way to approach a search firm?
So thanks for that question, because I'll tell you a quick story. I'm here in Washington, and so a lot of times I do what we call courtesy interviews, people who may not necessarily fit a search we're working on today, but could potentially be a candidate in the future. And one time I had a member of Congress who was transitioning out and thinking about next steps, and we sat down, I met with him, asked him a million questions, and said, thanks, if we have a search that looks to be a fit, we'll give you a holler. And like 2 weeks later, he called me and screamed at me because I had not called him about any searches. And I had to remind him that he wasn't my client, that my client is the board that is looking to find the CEO. And if he fit the bill, I'd call him. So just first and foremost, and not everybody, I didn't understand that when I first got into the search business. I thought, well, they're excited about me. They're looking for me. But the truth is, we're looking to find the right person for our client. And our client is defining what those needs and what those attributes are of that ideal candidate. So great ways to get on my radar, or if you are aware that I'm working on a search, that whether you're qualified or not, I'm always happy when somebody pings me. Maybe they've seen it in CEO Update or some other job posting. I'm always happy when somebody pings me and says, hey, Leslie, I understand you're doing the search for X, Y, or Z. I actually think I could be a good candidate for that. Here's my resume. Can we have that conversation? Or I'm not sure I'm the right candidate, but have you talked to Jamie? Because she'd be great. So being helpful to a search professional is terrific. As we go out and source and say, hey, we've got this search and we're looking for somebody awesome, help us out. recommend somebody, give us some thoughts, send us some resumes. So that's a great way. Another great way is, and I think Jim and Jamie both mentioned it, is really being engaged in your role. And the more you sit on a panel, the more you are on a committee, the more that you are raising your own visibility, it's super great, because we call around everybody and say, we're doing this search, who would be terrific? And if you've got a certain level of visibility, then oftentimes the same name comes up 3 or 4 times, and we're like, wow, we better go call Jim, because everybody's saying Jim's the guy. So do a great job, do well, raise your own visibility, help when you're called. Don't be afraid to reach out and say, what you shouldn't do is send a blind email to a headhunter and say, keep me in mind. I get about 50 of them a day, and I just have an automatic thank you and send them to our database. And I can't keep you all in mind. It's too hard. So I always say, help me help you. If you know of a search we're working on, or you can help me on a search I'm working on, then raise your hand and let's have that conversation. So that would be my thought.
Great, that's very helpful. And we've had several questions come up about the search process itself. And I think this is partially for Leslie, but also I think Jim and Jamie, if you can share some of your experience about this. The questions included, what are the things I should be putting on my resume to make sure that it stands out? And what are some questions that get asked in a CEO interview process? Whether it's that initial conversation or further along the line in the interview, how should I be preparing for this? So I don't know who would like to start on that.
I'll hop in on this one a little bit. I think something that a candidate for a position can do well and on their own is really do a deep dive about the community you're exploring, right? As you head into that process, you really need to understand the kind of culture that's made up there, the industry sectors that impact what's going to happen, the leadership, and really look into who sits on that leadership board and what kinds of industries do they make up. You can find out a lot by just doing a deep dive there, and any consultant you work with will help prepare you, but there's a great deal of being your own advocate involved in that process, right? And making sure you're taking those steps. So I think the best thing you can do is really do that deep dive. And then to the point of interview questions, maybe something I learned along the way, I would say in that experience, I definitely honed coming up with more experiential opportunities where I had stepped in and maybe taken a role, or had encountered some trouble along the way and had figured that out or moved a different direction. So I think you go in a lot and you worry about what might those questions look like, and what you really should worry about is pulling out your own personal expertise, because they want to see when is the time you use good judgment, and can we trust you to be our leader. So that's really more, I think, the advice I would give.
Jim, I'd add a couple unless you prefer. Okay, so first of all, on the resume, I really appreciate that question, because I do give this counsel a lot. Too often, and you've all seen them, you get a resume that says, responsible for membership, responsible for the trade show, responsible for advocacy. But what I want to read is, what did you do? Not just what were you responsible for, but what impact did you have? So if you write, grew membership 10% from this to that, increased trade show revenue from this to that, talk about the impact that your leadership had, not just your accomplishments, not just your responsibilities. So that's what we look for in the resume. In terms of questions to anticipate, I completely agree with what Jamie said. Committees really want you to do your homework, because at the end of the day, it's about them. They've got a problem, they've got a leadership hole, and they're trying to fill it. And the more you know about them and how your experience relates to their need, the more they appreciate it. So for example, in the association world, and maybe in some chamber, and maybe in chamber events too, we're all canceling events. So if you know that this organization had a huge chunk of their revenue tied to a specific event, to be able to say, we had that problem too, here's how we dealt with it, here's what we did. And then half the time the board's like, oh, okay, great. So understand what their challenge is and how your experience can meet that challenge. And really anticipate the job description should spell out, we're looking for somebody with these skills and experiences. So to the extent that you can say, you're looking for somebody with experience growing membership. Let me tell you what I did and how we did it. And this is the outcome, what I learned from that. So always be trying to read the spec. The big secret is, it's not a secret. We take the spec and we turn it into questions. We're looking for somebody who does this. Have you done that? Tell us how you did that. So the spec is going to give you a lot of clues. And finally, I would say a question to always anticipate is, maybe it's the false question or the mistake question, but what we're really trying to figure out is, what have you learned? We often ask, so think about yourself as a leader 10 years ago and who you are today. What have you learned during that time? How have you evolved as a leader? How have you changed? I have had people say, not at all, which is kind of disappointing. It kind of says, really? You haven't learned anything in 10 years? I love it when somebody says, when I think about how I was leading 10 years ago, these are all the mistakes I made. And now here's what I've learned from that. So showing that personal growth and development really gives boards and committees a sense that you are somebody who is still evolving and interested in learning. And that's very attractive to a committee. Hope that's helpful.
I can't add anything to those two answers because I think that's spot on. I do want to give, I think, an anecdotal example of something that I think helped me. So I was 33 when I applied and was going through the interview process that I have now. And when I came in for the interview, it was a corporate boardroom table, about 6 or 7 people sitting around the room, and I was significantly younger than anyone in the room. And I knew that. I probably looked like I just graduated high school too, even though I'd been in the chamber profession for 9 years. I had my IOM, had CCE, felt like I was experienced and ready. And I felt like I had a great interview. Felt like we had covered everything, just like Jamie and Leslie talked about what I had done and what I could bring to the table to fix their particular problems. But toward the end of the conversation, I was worried that nobody asked about my age or maturity. And so when the president of the University of Alabama, who was on the interview panel, asked me if there was anything that we hadn't discussed, I said yes. I'd like to address the elephant in the room, no pun intended, because of the University of Alabama, but I'd like to address the elephant in the room. There may or may not be concern in this room about my age and maturity, and I understand that. And there's nothing I can do about the number of years the good Lord put me on this earth. But I do want to talk about, reiterate my experience and talk about where I am in my life. And so I went on about that for 2 or 3 minutes, and they all nodded. A couple of people jotted notes. To this day, and I've become great friends with everybody that was on that interview panel because they were in chamber leadership. I've never asked them if that made a difference or not. But I guarantee you that made a difference, because I do think that was probably a concern among people in there, and the fact that I was candid and proactive and kind of had the self-awareness. Not saying I'm self-aware about everything, but I was on that one because I was almost a little paranoid about it, to be honest with you, that I addressed it up front. Not saying it made the difference, but I know it didn't hurt.
Oh, I applaud you for that. I think that was a really smart move because they can't ask you, right? And they probably loved that you did that. The only other thing I would add to all of that I was just remembering is one of the first questions you'll be asked is, why are you interested? Why do you want to do this? And you'd be surprised how many people don't have a good answer for that. It's like, oh, well, and it can't be because I want a bigger salary or a bigger job. It really can't. It has to be more about, because what I believe in what you're doing, because I want to grow as a professional, fine. I want to continue to grow, as you were saying, career versus job. I want to continue to develop and grow my career, but I really care about what you're doing. And so you should absolutely anticipate that question.
There's some great, I think, tips across the board. A couple of questions came up about whether ACCE has lists of search executive firms. We do, and we're happy to share those. So feel free to reach out to myself or Susan. We'd be happy to send you that list. And the question also came up about search firms that are in different markets across the country. We have those as well. There were a couple of related questions for Leslie that I'll try to kind of package together. One professional on the webinar said, I'm currently serving as the interim CEO of my local chamber. I'm actually from the events side of the house. I'm sort of an events professional. Do you find that there are specific industries that translate better into chamber leadership? That was one question about what translates into a chamber CEO role. And then sort of a semi-related question is, are you seeing more chamber CEOs that are coming from the chamber background or chamber CEOs that are coming from other backgrounds? Are you seeing any trend lines in experience for chamber CEO roles?
So I don't have metrics for those questions. I will tell you anecdotally that the answer, as you can imagine, is it depends. It depends on what the focal point or the key agenda items or goals are for each chamber. Some, as we know, are more focused on economic development. Some are more focused on local events. Some are more focused on advocacy. So, whether an events background is going to be appropriate and right for what that chamber needs at that moment in time, it really just does depend on what their priorities are at that juncture. So, maybe the answer is yes, if really what they want to do is completely reinvent their events and shows and different kind of gatherings, maybe that's exactly what they're looking for. But if their primary goal is to have some impact on an advocacy perspective, you're probably not the right person. So it just depends. And in terms of trends, I mean, Sherry Ann, you'd probably have some actual stats on that. I don't, but as I said earlier, we are increasingly asked to think broadly as we develop candidate slates, people who have both come from the chamber community and bring that experience and perspective, whether in the geographic region or beyond the geographic region, as well as people who may come from a more business kind of perspective. And again, it will be driven a lot by, what the chamber is trying to achieve. I will tell you from the association side, something like 75% of the people who run the major associations come from that more association, not-for-profit leadership background. And the reason being is a lot of times corporate executives have a very tough time, and I think this is true in chambers too, have a tough time transitioning into that not-for-profit consensus building kind of environment. They don't have the patience for it. And so a lot of times, I'm doing a search and there's a member of the board who's interested, and everybody loves Joe, and Joe's been on the board and he's great. But then I start to explain to him, Joe, you're going to go from being a peer in the boardroom to the paid staff executive. That is very different. And you are now not just responsible for leading the charge and making sure the events are great. If we're at a big hotel and I don't like the services of the hotel, I'm going to complain to you about it. Do you want to hear that? And all of a sudden they're like, oh, and by the way, you can't make unilateral decisions. You actually have to get buy-in for what you want to do. And all of a sudden, these folks who are used to operating in a very different environment, they start to think twice about whether this is the right move for them. That's not to say we can't point to really good examples of people who have transitioned very effectively into these roles. I just think it's a little bit of a harder, a higher mountain to climb for them.
They are not accustomed to hearing complaints about the chicken lunches. So yes, that's definitely a new world for them. From our perspective, we've been tracking some of that information about the backgrounds of chamber CEOs. It's a mix. We have seen, particularly in some of the larger markets, bringing in professionals who are not from the chamber universe. I can tell you there was a huge trend in that direction when I first came on board about 3.5 years ago. We're starting to see that sort of peter off to some degree. We've also seen several, for lack of a better word, implosions, where people were brought in from the outside and things did not work out very, very quickly. I know a lot of you in the chamber industry have heard about these, where CEOs are in the role for maybe 8 months, 14 months, and then they're gone. So we're seeing an increased interest in chamber backgrounds. One of the questions that came up that also has to do with sort of hiring trends is around diversity. And I thought this was a very good question about the diversity within the chamber landscape and whether it's more challenging or less challenging to move up in the chamber industry if you are a diverse professional? And this is a great question, and it's something that we've been dealing with at the board level at ACCE for a couple of years now. I think on the whole, unfortunately, our industry is not a wildly diverse industry at this stage of the game, and that's something that we recognize as a problem because it's not representative of the communities that we serve. And so there are lots of things that we put in place at ACCE to try to address this. Between our diversity, equity, and inclusion division, we put together our scholarship for leadership diversity to try to bring in more diverse individuals into the fold of what we're doing. But that's something that has been an ongoing challenge. That being said, a lot of the search firms that we have worked with, when they're looking for candidates for roles, one of the top priorities that we hear time and time again is we are looking for diverse candidates. And that's been, from nearly every search that I've been asked to help out on, that's been one of the #1 top criteria, is they are looking for diverse candidates. Leslie, I'm sure you can share more insight on that fact, but it's a very good question that's been brought up.
No, totally agree. And I'll tell you, even just from my business perspective, we should not even bother to go to a pitch if we don't have a diverse team. So they're not just requiring it of their slates, they're requiring it of their search partner. So you've got to show us that you are not, an all-white team.
Absolutely. One of the questions that came up, what challenges do internal candidates face for being considered for a CEO role? So if you've got a good, strong internal candidate, what are some of the hurdles they may encounter, and maybe any tips to help them through that? I don't know if anybody has thoughts on that question.
I have thoughts, but I've been doing a lot of the talking. So if Jamie or Jim, if you have a perspective, please. No?
No, Leslie, take it away.
Is Jamie frozen?
We may have frozen Jamie, unfortunately, in that cold Colorado weather.
Yeah. Okay, so internal candidates. So our rule of thumb is that internal candidates should be treated with the same, if not greater care than a external candidate. That communication with the internal candidate is paramount. We have to make sure that they know what's happening and when it's happening and all the rest of it. Another rule is that I encourage committees not to bring in an internal candidate unless they really believe they're legitimate. Like, don't just do it for fun. Don't do it because you're going to give them a courtesy, because they're going to feel it, they're going to know it, and why should you raise their expectations, get them all ready to go if you're not serious? So some of the challenges that we face are committees who feel like, who can't be candid with an internal candidate and say, we love you, we don't think you're ready, and they bring them into a process and they're not sincere about it, and that backfires. I also feel like if you don't get the job as an internal candidate, my goal is always that whoever gets the job, that you as the internal candidate would say, I understand why they went in that direction, and I can learn from this person. So one of the hurdles or challenges is that the attraction of a shiny new penny that committees often want, somebody who's new and different and going to bring new ideas, that's a challenge. What we find is that an internal candidate is most attractive when an organization is not necessarily looking to make change. If they're not looking to turn left or turn right, but just continue on the path. If there is a well-trained and well-prepared internal candidate who can transition into that role, that is a nice glide path for them. You should not be offended if your search committee or if your board wants to stack you up against the external market. You should feel good about that, because if you're the right person, you will withstand that process, and you will feel better that you have been selected from a slate of qualified candidates, that even though you had the inside track, you were still the right person. But again, you have to, if an organization feels like they're doing a search for someone who's been in the job for 10, 15, 20 years, it is really hard for an internal candidate who's been there at that person's right side to say, I'm going to be an agent for change, because you've been part of the infrastructure for a long time. So it's not impossible. It's just a little bit harder. And then they might say, well, if you think all these great changes should have happened, why didn't you do it? Why didn't you agitate for them? So the question is, what does the committee want? What does the board want? Do they want to continue in the path and be sort of in this, following the same path? Or Are they really looking for change? And if they're really looking for change, you have to have the candid conversation with yourself about your ability to actually lead change after you've been a part of it for a long time.
Fantastic. I think that's the perfect note to end on. And I am so grateful for our panelists and all the information and insight they've been able to share. This is, I think, just a lot of good food for thought for everyone. As always, if you have follow-up questions, the team at ACCE is happy to help. We also have some mentoring programs. So if you're on this call and you're looking to perhaps find some guidance from others within the community, we're happy to pair you up with seasoned professionals within the chamber world. So with that, I'll turn it over to Susan for final thoughts, but thank you again to our panelists for the great insights today.
Thanks, Sherry Ann, and thank you so much, Leslie and Jim and Jamie. Fascinating conversation. I took lots of notes, wonderful insights. I really appreciate you all being here. Just wanted to remind all of you that the webinar was recorded and will be posted on our webinar page no later than Monday the 18th. I've also have the contact information for our panelists on this slide. You should feel free to reach out directly if you have follow-up questions. I included my contact information there too if you do need additional resources on these topics, or if you're interested in the CCE program. I run that program, so happy to talk with you about that. Our next ACC webinar is on Thursday, February 2nd, and we're going to be talking about best practices for mission-based fundraising strategies through Chamber Foundations. So I hope you'll consider joining us then. You can register through that for that webinar through our events page, just like you registered for this one. So once again, thank you, panelists. Thank you, everyone, for your great engagement and questions. Hope everyone has a wonderful afternoon, and we will see you all on our next ACC webinar.
Thank you. Thanks so much.
Everyone.